Welcome to the School of Forest Resources and within the College of the Environment. We're in our 10th month of a new birth in pulling a group of different departments and schools together. And I think if I looked at the list of people that are attending today and the diversity of topics that they're interested in, I think it's a perfect reflection of the sort of broadening of all of our visions. So welcome. I just want to very quickly frame a number of issues that I think will be covered in today's series of papers. And I've used this particular slide as sort of as a way of illustrating sort of, I think, maybe a value or a vision that many of us have for the Puget Sound region. From the water, in essence, to from the white caps to the white tops, this is a special place on the globe. And I think many of us see value in retaining certain elements of that place and understanding the pressure that those elements may be coming under and what we might do in terms of solutions. And we come at this from a whole range of perspectives, and I think that range of perspectives make for a very healthy discussion. So today's talk will be outlined around a number of themes. Three first talks will talk about the problem. And then the next sort of two sets of three talks are from a range of different perspectives, and they deal with those perspectives and solutions to the problems that have been outlined. So I think the context in which this discussion is thinking in terms of healthy forests and healthy forest landscapes, and the definition of health spans from the ecological to the social and economic. And this is a picture of a spruce budworm devoured grand fir on the east side of the Cascades. And even though we're just dealing with the west side, I think the forest health issues span. We're also thinking about the goods and services that forested systems provide, whether those are cultural or spiritual or recreational services, or are they monetary services. We're thinking about the broad suite that these things provide. And so there's a universal sense that the services that they provide have more value than, say, a shopping center. Let's just sort of frame it in that way. And then hopefully that gets reflected in the water quality, air quality, the quality of life that is in this particular state. So thinking of healthy people, thinking then in terms of these things, in terms of climate change and the impact that climate change may have on these systems, and even on what's now been termed climate refugees. So people from other parts of the world that might see the stability we have in the Pacific Northwest as a place to migrate to or immigrate to. Population increases in the area. And then I would also like to recognize the Denman Endowment for making these conversations possible and important. So one other sort of contextual thing is sort of the idea of reference points. So where do we, in our discussion of a system, whether it's an ecological system or a human system, what point do we use as a reference frame? And so here's an old-growth forest. Might have been a vision that people had in 1928 of this old-growth forest. And then, if you grew up in the 1990s, this might be your view of what an old-growth forest looks like. It's already changing in scope, but now this becomes our new reference point or our new baseline. And then as we continue in 2028, this may become our reference point. So the point is that in thinking about recovering systems or monitoring systems, you need these kinds of reference points to come back to. So we're going to explore this, and I welcome your participation and comments as we move forward. Thank you very much.
First speaker in this session is Steve Stinson, who's the Executive Director of the Family Forest Foundation. So it's appropriate that he's going to tell us about family forest landowners of Puget Sound and what their contributions are. Steve.
Well, thank you very much. First and foremost, I am a family forest landowner, and my family's objective is to keep our land and forestry in perpetuity, if we could be so bold. And that's really what I spend most of my time doing. What we have here is a map of the state's small forest landowners. It's derived from the Washington State Forest Land Dataset Project. I'd like to acknowledge the vision and foresight of Senator Patty Murray and Congressman Norm Dix for funding this project. This project would also not be possible without the intellectual capacity and, quite frankly, the creative genius of Luke Rogers and his staff here at the University of Washington. As you can see in the dark green, we've got about 215,000 small forest landowners in this state. That's 5.7 million acres, and that makes this the largest forest landowner class in the state. In the yellow, we've highlighted the Washington Farm Forestry Association, the DNR Forest Stewardship Plans, and the American Tree Farm Certification Management Plans and Ownerships. I'm spending just a little bit of time on this because the data set that sits underneath this map, we call this our $1 million map, is the foundation for the majority of the analysis that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So the topic today is the Puget Sound and the area around it. This is a breakout of the land ownership within Puget Sound. Pretty self-explanatory, but you can see we've got a large chunk of public lands. Ag and urban representing about 14.5%, small forest landowners at 16%, and our industrial forest landowners at about 14.5%, and a bit of tribal land up there at 0.4%. This is the same area broken out by forest land acres and owner types. Each pie in this chart represents the area of private forest land in the action area owned by different owner types. The size of the pie chart is relative to the amount of private forest land in the action area. The data set's a pretty amazing tool. We basically got 39 counties tax assessor records incorporated in a seamless text parcel database that allows analysis like this to be possible. So 31% of the Puget Sound's uplands are private forest lands. If you want to look at it a little bit differently, you've heard this number earlier, but with this data set, we were able to do a risk of conversion, potential rate of conversion analysis for the state, and here it is for these counties in the Puget Sound watersheds. Again, each pie chart represents the area of the forest land that either stayed in forest land or was converted to other uses between 1988 and 2004. And again, the size of the chart is relative to the area within that county. Take-home message. We've lost over 900,000 acres of state and private forest land to non-forest use in that 14-year period. This data set and this analysis allows us to focus in on where private forests have the greatest risk of conversion. And the way we determine that is basically by taking the real estate value of the forest land versus its forest land value. And when that ratio gets high, the risk increases. We've got a pretty new concept floating around in the conservation world these days. It's called anchor forests. The idea is to focus conservation efforts in areas where we know significant areas of forest will remain forested due to their ownership classes. For example, tribal, federal, some state, and some designated forest lands make ideal areas within which to focus our conservation needs. One of the things this tool has allowed us to do is project conversion, particularly the percentage of conversion in a watershed by the year 2050. In general, a watershed, when it reaches 10% and greater of impervious surface area, starts to see a diminishing in its ecological functions. The dark red and the lighter red are well in exceedance of 10%. I'm kind of a landowner stat nerd. So we took the data set, the 215,000 landowners, prioritized them by risk of conversion, low, medium, and high, and sent them a survey. Asked them all kinds of complicated questions, but the focus of it was we really wanted to know why they own their forest land and what challenges they face in maintaining their forest land, as we hope to inform the development of conservation policies. So I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, but they all have a common theme. We used a Likert scale of 1 to 5 to rank the importance of the response. 1 is low importance, 5 is high importance. We've seen many landowners that have seen 100% take of their property due to regulatory impacts in this state, and we're showing 50% of landowners consider that to be a serious challenge to maintaining their forest land ownership. We asked people what percentage of their forest land investment they would be willing to donate to the public in the form of public values. And this is kind of an interesting question. People are currently giving these services away for free. So why do we have this sort of response when we cage it in economic terms? I think that should inform our conservation policy efforts. Regulatory complexity is a pretty good issue. We have the highest standards in the nation for forest practices rules, but they are exceedingly complex. As has been mentioned by numerous people, we've seen a lot of changes in our forest practice rules and regulations. 19 significant changes since its inception in 1973. It takes me a minimum of 50 and sometimes up to 100 years to grow a tree, and it's very difficult to plan with that rate of change. Trying to get some feel for why people are on their landscape. 39% of them harvested in the last 10 years, 61% haven't. And only 43% indicate they intend to harvest in the next 10. Now this number does go up with scale of ownership. Average ownership in this survey was about 40 acres. You get up to 100 acres, 200 acres, that number goes up, but representative of the study, it's 43%. Yet when you ask them if this is a sound financial investment, about 60% indicate that's of high or medium-high importance. So I think that's something we need to consider as we continue to develop conservation policies. Clearly, we've got a strong interest in family legacy, transferring our properties from one generation to another. We've got a lot of written forest management plans. The national average for written forest management plans across the 50 states is about 5%. I give credit to the Washington State's Forest Stewardship Program and their coach planning classes to having this number be as high as it is. Our friends over at the Washington Forest Protection Association are forever polling the general public on how they're doing as an industry. I thought I'd share a few of those slides with you. We do consider the harvesting and replanting and use of wood products to be a green industry in this state. Almost 80% of us buy off on that. And we think that the forest products companies are pretty important to the state's economy. Even 10 years later, we're still polling at 88%. Had a little chat already today about woody biomass. Obviously, it's a controversial issue. So again, asked the general public what they thought about woody biomass in terms of its ability to be used for electricity and fuel. Got pretty good support for the use of woody biomass, 64%. 15% in opposition. And I think this really is the high point for woody biomass, but the production of liquid fuels is really where the bang for the buck comes. You know, regardless of where you stand on forestry or global warming, if this society can't figure out how to quit importing oil from foreign countries that don't like us, we aren't going to be here very long. So what do we know? Forest lands make significant contributions to Puget Sound's health. Obviously, these lands are at risk of conversion to non-forest use. Family forest landowners view regulatory takings and complexity as significant challenges to maintaining their forest lands. So what do we know? Washington State's current regulatory approach has struggled to address family forest landowners' needs. I used to implement the small forest landowner office. When I was there, we had a staff of 12. Today, we have a staff of 2. The forest riparian easement program, pays landowners 50 cents on the dollar for the timber left in the buffer, has not been funded for the last 2 years, has a backlog of $8 million and a total cost to the state of $1 billion at last year's log prices. Alternate planning templates. In the last decade, we've developed two. Neither of them address less costly regulatory prescriptions, which were mandated by the legislature. The Family Forest Habitat Conservation Plans currently gathering dust at our federal agencies. They are refusing to process this incidental take application due to unsubstantiated scientific differences, when their own policies state that scientific differences are not cause for denying moving an application forward to the public comment process under the National Environmental Policy Act. The general public appears to view forestry in a favorable light. We appear to support the use of woody biomass for power and fuel. And it appears that forestry is the preferred land use amongst our regulators and many in the environmental community. So I've had the privilege of working with my 77-year-old father for the last 6 months. I had to limit him to 2 tanks of gas on our PCT units, but it's given me cause to reflect, and I'd like to share a couple with you. In Washington state, we set forest policy via intimidation, through fiscal leveraging, litigation, or the threat thereof, and legislation. Approaches based on common sense, best available science, and logic have difficulty finding traction in this environment. We lack a process that allows the preponderance of scientific information to move forward while acknowledging dissenting opinions in a transparent manner, and that's a mouthful, but we're left with dueling scientists. Does little to advance science, and it really discourages policymakers. So what can we do? Let's enact a Family Forest Act that provides smaller buffers on smaller streams. Fully fund the Small Forest Landowner Office and its programs as enacted by House Bill 2091. Fully fund the Forest Stewardship Program. We are the only state in the nation that doesn't match the federal dollars to the Forest Stewardship Program, 1 out of 50. And of course, we should implement the Family Forest Habitat Conservation Plan. We need to acknowledge the economic, ecological, and social contributions of sustainable forestry by promoting markets for Washington wood, implementing term transfer development right programs, implementing ecosystem service districts to compensate landowners for the public values that they provide, and implement an anchor forest strategy. We have an aging forest landowner class and must facilitate the development of succession and intergenerational transfer plans. We need to encourage the next generation to get involved in their family forest management. We should encourage investment in forestry by promoting the economic viability of forest land ownership. It's kind of an old graph, but I really like it. We've got down here in the bottom blue, timber value, and then ecosystem services. The point that I'd really like to reinforce is that timber values are the foundation for economic viability. Ecosystem services will be additive and will never replace timber value. I've had the privilege of sitting on the governor's forest sector working group for carbon for the last 4 years, and this white line is a little bit optimistic. I am very doubtful that family forest landowners will ever see a nickel in carbon credits. Larger forest landowners might be able to pull that off. Currently, it costs about $15 a ton to participate in the regional carbon standards. Carbon's trading for about $5 a ton, so we got a ways to go. The challenges that we face: money is scarce. This state cannot afford the timber value in the forest riparian easement program or the buffers under forest and fish. Our current regulatory status is firmly entrenched. We need to support leadership willing to address difficult issues. I've got a lot of solutions, but none of them are easy to implement. Strong leadership must be supported. If we are unable to step outside of the box and address the issues facing family and private forest ownership, we're going to see an increase in the rate of conversion to non-forest uses. That's not good for Puget Sound. That's not good for you and me. If you'd like more information on the Washington State Forest Land Database, you can go to ruraltech.org. You can Google the Washington State Forest Land Data Set.
So, next speaker is Dan Stonington, who serves as the Cascade Land Conservancy's Conservation Policy Director, where he's responsible for the policy development for rural lands, conservation finance, and ecosystem service markets. He's going to talk about the Cascade Agenda and upland strategy for Puget Sound. Dan.
Thanks. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's a group with a lot of talent and a lot of experience, so I'm honored to have the chance to talk a little bit about the Cascade Agenda, some of the tools that we're working on to address what has been very well introduced today, which is what's happening and a lot about why it's happening and why there's these important connections between the forested uplands and the health of Puget Sound. So again, my name's Dan Stonington. I'm our Conservation Policy Director for Cascade Land Conservancy. Just a quick background on Cascade Land Conservancy before I jump in. We're Washington's largest independent land trust, so we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work in the central Puget Sound and central Cascades region and have helped conserve around 150,000 acres, been around for about 20 years. Here's where I'm going today. I just want to start with growth trends. As we've heard from some of our earlier speakers, it's a real driver for some of the challenges that we're facing. I want to talk about the Cascade Agenda, which is a strategic approach for conservation and smart growth in the central Puget Sound region, and then look at some of the top strategies that have come out of this vision of the Cascade Agenda and what these mean for how we can address a lot of the challenges that have come up today. So growth, we've heard about this already this afternoon. So this is just a graph from Puget Sound Regional Council. If you look out a long ways, 100 years, we're looking at in the range of 15 new cities the size of Seattle coming to the Puget Sound Basin. This is out to 2040 for the Puget Sound Regional Council counties, looking at about 1.6 million new folks, a million new jobs. So a lot of folks coming to the region, and actually almost half of those are our own kids and grandkids. And as we've already talked about, this has implications for Puget Sound. So this is a quote from the Puget Sound Partnership's Action Agenda. Population growth and climate change are expected to exacerbate the threats that are already affecting the health of Puget Sound. And correspondingly, or in response, priority A1 in the Action Agenda has to do with looking at that growth that's coming. Let's protect the intact ecosystems. And that's a lot of where the nexus is between the uplands conservation strategies that Cascade Land Conservancy is working on with many partners in the region. So not only is there a lot of growth happening in the region, but there's some interesting numbers on where it's happening. So looking at the first 7 years of Puget Sound Regional Council's Vision 2040 plan, there's some discrepancy between what we were essentially expecting to happen and what really did happen in terms of where that growth goes. So metro cities are places like Seattle, Bellevue, Everett. These are classifications in the adopted regional growth strategy for King, Pearson, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties. And the basic message here is that more growth than anticipated was going into the rural areas and the small cities, and not as much growth as we wanted, if you will, was going into the places where that was designated. A line item that actually doesn't show up here is resource lands, so the farmlands and forest lands and mineral lands of long-term commercial significance. And those are facing development, but that's actually one thing that Puget Sound Regional Council doesn't even track. So there's not even information for that. So message being the growth is happening quickly. It's not necessarily going where we want. Let's come up with some new strategies to address that. A couple of examples of how this is playing out on the landscape. I just want to talk about a couple pieces of property where we're seeing some of these impacts and some examples of conversion. So one is down in southern Pierce County, and sort of zooming in on the yellow star here. The two brown clusters of parcels in the center of your screen, this is down near the pack forest, UW pack forest on the Pierce County, Thurston County border. So this was about 5,000 acres of former Weyerhaeuser timberland. It was sold off between about 2004 and 2007 in 20-acre parcels. And as we've heard from speakers earlier this afternoon, there's important questions to be asking about the impacts of that conversion trend, impacts in terms of impervious surface, impacts in terms of the cost of services for local governments to service those properties. And then I think there's also been some good comments earlier today on why this is happening. It's the fact that there's development value that exists on that property, and those are rights that that landowner is entitled to and that legally exist. There's changes in the timber markets. We've heard of changing ownership patterns. So all of these forces are kind of conspiring to make this really the option that's available to a lot of the forested landowners, is to break it up and sell it off as real estate. There's another parcel that is up in central King County that has not yet converted and parceled out, but is, for all intents and purposes, kind of on the same trajectory. So this is about 700 acres. This is just south of Carnation, and it's zoned as 10-acre lots. So that's basically the legal development option. It hasn't done this yet. This is our GIS guy being crafty with graphics, but that's basically the legal option for the property owner, is to sell it off with this possibility of development. So this is all just by way of saying there's forces on the landscape, and let's be thinking about strategies to address that. So that's where the Cascade Agenda comes in. The Cascade Agenda is a vision for conserving 1.3 million acres across King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kittitas counties. And then as the flip side of that conservation coin, and one that is just as important for Puget Sound, and one that's mentioned in the action agenda, is focusing growth into our existing urban footprint, providing incentives for that to happen. So that's the vision of the Cascade Agenda, and is addressing some of these challenges that we're talking about this morning. Here's another way of just looking at some of the challenges in terms of conservation and what that means in terms of conservation tools. So in terms of public and philanthropic dollars, those have been a lot of the strategies we've relied on in the past to achieve a lot of great conservation wins. Those dollars are in the millions, and if we're looking across the landscape at 1.3 million acres, the private forest land that are under the various pressures that we've talked about this afternoon, that conservation value, in order to address that development value on that property, that's values that's in the billions. So there's a big gap there, and we need new tools, and market-based tools is where the Cascade Agenda points to for addressing that gap. So that's what you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Value-added conservation tools, things like transfer of development rights, where you're adding value into development projects. New financing resources, where you can look to the value that's in forested land and use that to help finance conservation. Alignment of market and regulatory forces, and we've heard about that in terms of ecosystem markets. So I'd just like to take the remaining time that I have to step through some of the tools that are out there in terms of these three areas. So here's the strategies I'd like to talk about. There's a piece of legislation, transfer of development rights and infrastructure, that links those two. I'll talk about that. The concept of villages and hamlets, how can we take the rural development potential and put it in a much more compact footprint? Community forestry bonds is on the financing side. And we've already heard a little bit about environmental markets or ecosystem service markets, and I'll touch on that. So transfer of development rights, I think we've just, Steve had one slide that mentioned it briefly. The basic concept here is that each piece of property has a bundle of rights. You might have access rights, timber rights, mineral rights, development rights, and those can be, as sort of counterintuitive as it is to separate some of those from the actual property, those can be bought and sold separately. So a transfer of development rights marketplace, the idea is really to create an incentive or an option for a landowner that's interested in selling and permanently removing development potential from their property and selling it to someone who wants to build more than what the current zoning allows them. So it's a transfer system that functionally it focuses growth into areas where the program designates is most appropriate for that growth. And then those development rights are bought by a developer, and that money goes to compensate the landowner for forgoing that development potential. So that's the basic idea of this market-based and voluntary approach. And one of the challenges with transfer development rights is on the urban receiving area side, if you will. So the areas where we're looking to transfer that development potential to, which is first and foremost cities. And cities are facing a lot of challenges. You saw it in the percentage graph that I spelled out a little bit earlier, where cities aren't quite meeting their growth target. A lot of that growth is going in a higher proportion into rural areas, and that regional growth strategy is not aligned. Cities are working on housing affordability, and that's a real challenge. Infrastructure money is a real challenge in urban areas. And in some ways, if it's not done correctly, a TDR, transfer of development rights, can add to some of those challenges. So the idea that is live right now was proposed in last legislative session, and that's coming back to Olympia this year, is linking infrastructure money for cities to a transfer of development rights program to address this need on the part of the cities. So the quick schematic is, it's a tool called tax increment financing, and that's a whole Denman lecture series in and of itself. But it's a tool that Washington State is only one of a couple in the nation that doesn't really have access to full tax increment financing for constitutional reasons. And so this would sort of take a modified approach to tax increment financing, and the idea is to address sprawl and urban infrastructure needs together by linking new sources of money for cities to transfer of development rights. So a city would plan for their transfer of development rights program. It would enable this infrastructure investment, which would then attract the development to the cities, and then that development that comes in would be purchasing development rights from the farm and forest landowners who are willing sellers. So stay tuned, that's coming up this legislative session, and it's one that we think is really promising for addressing a lot of these challenges. Idea number 2, villages and hamlets. So the basic idea here is going back to our carnation forest, our Snoqualmie forest example. Again, you have this 700-acre piece of property. This is basically the option that's available to the landowner right now. So what if we could enable some other option that, instead of developing out in those 10-acre lots that has a lot of impact in terms of impervious surface and habitat fragmentation, if we can enable something where you instead are building something quaint and cute and very livable with a lot of permanently conserved space all around it. So seems like a great way to both address some of the growth that's coming to your region, as well as preserving quality of life and just giving a much better option to those rural landowners. So it would be the equivalent of taking this development potential, putting it in a much smaller portion of the property, and that means you're conserving that remaining portion of this property. But if you're also transferring development in from other adjacent properties, you can be conserving a lot more around it. And this is an example, but it's also based on numbers of what that underlying zoning is. And with a small village, you really could get thousands of acres of permanent conservation, depending on how you kind of configure that transfer mechanism. So that's idea number 2. These are about value-added conservation. On the financing piece, there is a bill that is in Congress right now that would enable something called community forestry bonds. And community forestry bonds is basically a way to enable qualified conservation organizations to tap into the tax-exempt revenue bond market. There's literally hundreds of billions of dollars that exchanges hands in this market, and it's something that's used for financing nonprofit hospitals and public works projects. The idea being, let's enable organizations to use the value that's in the timber to finance the acquisition. It is a bill that is live in the Senate Finance and Ways and Means Committee. It is getting great co-sponsorship from our delegation locally, And there's a number of partners working on it around the country to enable this tool for conservation acquisitions. So the last topic, this picture was just a little bit too appealing to pass up. So as we've heard from previous speakers, environmental markets are really a way to look at some of the different values that exist on property, whether it's provision of water quality or wildlife, wetlands, and look at a way to create credits around those values and make markets around them so that you can use those ecosystem values for conservation. Part of the reason that I like to show this photograph is that in the past, in terms of some of the mitigation approaches, the Section 404 permitting processes that the Army Corps of Engineers has administrated over the last several decades has actually resulted in a lot of loss of wetlands. And some of the new approaches that have come out from the Army Corps of Engineers has said, let's take a look at how we're doing environmental mitigation in a watershed context. So not focusing necessarily as much on on-site mitigation, but looking across the watershed that if there's some sort of impact, how can we go and do mitigation or do restoration in the place that's going to have the best impact across the watershed as a whole. So we're putting a bunch of money into mitigation. It's not necessarily getting us as much bang for the buck as we want. Let's put it someplace better. So that's a lot of what Puget Sound Partnership is looking to accomplish in their in-lieu-fee mitigation program. They got some money from the legislator to start some pilot projects, which kind of creates an initial bank for the program. But then really moving forward, it's about taking the money that's going into mitigation, using it in a watershed context around Puget Sound. So those are some of the tools that are live right now, and again, appreciate the opportunity to come and be here today. Thanks so much.
Okay, so our final presentation in this session is given by John Lombard. John is an independent consultant and part-time lecturer at the University of Washington, where he teaches a course on the Puget Sound ecosystem each fall. And he's the author of a book, Saving Puget Sound, a Conservation Strategy for the 21st Century. John.
Great, thanks very much, Bob, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. Let me begin by just asking, how many of you are familiar with the opening lines of Leo Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina? Well, a less literate crowd than I expected here at the university. I'll give you a hint. It doesn't start exactly this way, but the novel, of course, begins, or at least, of course, for those of you who've read it, begins by talking about families, not ecosystems. But the principles really apply pretty much equally in either way. A lot of different things have to go right, or at least well enough, for a family to be happy. Parents need to be compatible, need to have a strong interest in their children. People need to maintain relatively good health, be free of major accidents, and so on. The same principle basically applies to ecosystems. Of course, ecosystems themselves are not happy, but what we're really talking about here are whether we are happy with them. Happy in particular with what they do for us, both materially, but then very definitely also spiritually. If we're going to apply the Anna Karenina principle to Puget Sound, again, many different things have to go right, or at least well enough, for us to be happy with this ecosystem. I've listed here some of the most obvious, some of the most significant issues. The first one, habitat loss, avoiding major new habitat loss and degradation. That is the top issue identified in the Puget Sound Partnership's Action Agenda appropriately. Also really the top issue here on this list that relates most directly to forestry. Stormwater. The second top issue listed in the Puget Sound Partnership Action Agenda, again, I think appropriately, and also directly linked to forestry, and in this case, more for the benefits that forests provide, especially as Rob Harrison had noted, not just the forest vegetation, but the forest soils and how they potentially can dramatically limit the impacts that we have downstream. Wastewater remains certainly an important issue. I think a lot of people tend to believe that we've addressed it with our treatment plants, and for the traditional pollutants and in places where we are treating it in that way, I think that's probably generally true. But septic systems remain a very big issue around the region. And when you look at so-called emerging chemicals of concern, things like pharmaceuticals and new synthetic chemicals and so on, wastewater continues to be a major challenge for the receiving body of water, which is ultimately Puget Sound. Water withdrawals, really crucial issue, and one that frankly I think is underplayed in the Puget Sound Action Agenda. I'll talk a little bit more here later about water supply issues, and some of my previous speakers have also actually touched on that. And last but not least, salmon harvests and hatcheries. All the issues above that relate to salmon habitat, but harvest and hatcheries certainly are going to affect salmon populations very much as well. Salmon are crucial for our ecosystem here in Puget Sound, and in particular crucial for those things about it that matter directly to us. Now, no secret here, and certainly pretty well covered by previous speakers, the two key threats to our making progress on these issues are population growth and climate change. Now, I was interested to see the quote taken from the Action Agenda that these issues may potentially exacerbate threats to the Sound. I'd have to say my students in a 200 level class on the very first day have, I think, a better grasp of how fundamental these issues are. But I think that's in part a reflection of the fact that the Action Agenda has been built with this Save the Sound by 2020 mantra that was really what they inherited, not what they necessarily would be articulating themselves. But if we're going to look out beyond 2020, then I think there is no question that these are the huge threats facing this region, at least ecologically. Our population is likely to at least double, as Dan Stonington was just noting, and it's most likely to far more than double in places that are especially important ecologically, like our island communities, area around Hood Canal, and so on. Climate change is going to be a huge influence on a whole wide range of concerns, but again, one that I would stress is water supply. When we look at climate change reducing our snowpack and therefore reducing the amount of water available to both us and natural systems at the same time as we see this sort of population growth and demands for new consumption, it's going to be a huge challenge for this region. Now, the good news here, when we consider these two issues together, these two threats together, is that many of the most important actions that we could take to address one are also among the most important actions that we could take to address the other. I'm going to start with forests, not necessarily because they would be the very first place I'd start under any circumstances, but because that is the focus of this meeting today. When we look at these issues here, these are the most important things that we could do to sequester more carbon, to reduce the overall regional contribution that we make to greenhouse gases globally. They're also probably the most important things we could do ecologically to improve the way the forests function. Water conservation, again, obviously crucial if water supply is going to become a bigger and bigger challenge. But even if we just look at things right now, the less water we take out, the more water left for Mother Nature, generally a good thing. Riparian protection and restoration. Riparian areas are crucial for the temperature of water through shade, through microclimate, through helping control groundwater inflows. They also, as we've heard earlier, are key for habitat in themselves and key for the stream habitat next to them. So again, a top issue that addresses both concerns. So just cover a few additional ones. The Puget Sound nearshore, not necessarily a top issue when you're thinking about forestry, but if we're really looking just now for the moment at the Karenina principle of all the different issues for the Sound, the Puget Sound shoreline is really, it provides the most diverse habitats of any place within the overall region. It's the most sensitive and the most productive part of the marine ecosystem. And if we could just simply place more of new development further away from the shoreline, that's going to be both good for the natural processes along the shoreline and, in fact, generally good for that development as sea level rises. Floodplains, the second most diverse and dynamic set of habitats that we have here within this region. And one where, as I think we've already heard, the most important thing that we could do from a habitat perspective is to let rivers do more of their own thing. To pull back levees or even remove them where possible. Let's have a more natural interaction between rivers and their floodplains. But if we're looking at the effects of climate and the likelihood of having larger and more frequent floods, well, it's an even greater or an even better idea than it is right now to get out of the floodplain and let those rivers do what they want. Expanding and diversifying protected areas, fairly obvious, obviously something that would be important ecologically, but also something that really makes sense from a climate perspective as we look at the need for species to move in response to climate change. Now, if we look for studies that have really considered how the entire landscape functions and what it results for key ecosystem issues, and in this case, a study that didn't look at climate change, so it kind of reinforces some of the points that these are high priorities one way or the other. The one study that I would point to first here in the Northwest was actually not from Puget Sound, but from the Willamette River Basin in western Oregon. The Willamette Alternative Futures Project was a 6-year, $10 million study completed in 2002 that looked at the major choices that region could make for accommodating projected growth over the next 50 years or so, which was looking at essentially doubling their population. Now, for reasons of time, I'm not going to review all of the results of that study, but the key issues for what they call the conservation future, the one that led, in fact, to, under their analysis, admittedly, is without climate change, but potentially improving most ecological indicators while accommodating a doubling of population, were these issues here. Trying to limit rural sprawl, which you can put in a different form as limit forest conversion to development, as we've just been talking about. Restore floodplains, including restoring floodplain forests, restore and protect riparian areas, and protect mature forests. Really all key issues that we've already been talking about. And while it is certainly true that if you added climate change into this analysis, these bars would go down, because these are such key issues and these other futures don't address them so well, they'd actually go down further. That reinforces the value of the issues that are highlighted here. Now here in the Puget Sound region, we're very similar to the Willamette Basin, similar enough that pretty much all those same issues would apply here as well. But we are different, and we're different in ways that generally add to those issues rather than change them. We, of course, in contrast to the Willamette, have a big marine estuary running right through the middle of our ecosystem. And so, again, as we've talked about, Puget Sound shoreline, what happens there not just with the physical habitat, but with the pollutants that we dump out into it. Crucial issue. But I would also note that there are, particularly important I think for a forest conference, that there are key specific places for forest protection and forest restoration here in Puget Sound that really are playing disproportionate roles in the future of our ecosystem. That would include the Snoqualmie Wildlife Corridor here that actually extends a little bit beyond the area that drains into Puget Sound itself, but it's a natural bottleneck between the North Cascades and the Central Cascades, one that we've fragmented with both fragmented land ownership and I-90 running through there, but one that's going to become that much more important as climate change forces species to move north. Hood Canal. We heard about this from some earlier speakers as well. I think, in fact, I guess it was the study that Rob had noted on soils that the forests around Hood Canal are particularly important. Hood Canal has very poor marine circulation. That's the main reason for those much more frequent dead zones. And so the long-term health of Hood Canal is very much dependent on our ability to protect those forests in the upland areas. Salmon refugia. This wasn't as clearly put in earlier talks as I thought it might be. What we know from study of salmon is that they're extremely sensitive to the cutting down of forests and their stream basins. And so if we're going to have salmon recovery, and that's going to ultimately rely on refuges for salmon, we need to be protecting the last best places for salmon and having a distribution of those places across the major watersheds of the region. And that was not something that was really emphasized in the Willamette, although I think it really applies just as well down there. And then last, again, water conservation. This was something that wasn't directly included in the Willamette. It's kind of hard to do some of the modeling that it requires, but it's absolutely a crucial issue for us over the long term. Okay, wrapping up. Sometimes, you got the Mother Nature says, well, Karenina says. Many, many different actions needed ultimately to address both the climate and ecological challenges here of the Puget Sound region, and they really need to move forward together if we are ultimately going to be happy with our ecosystem and with what we get from it. And for a conference on forestry, just to focus on the forest issues again, forests are going to play a key role. How we manage those forests, both for carbon sequestration and for their ecological value. Minimizing the conversion of those forests to other land uses. Protecting key places like, again, the Snoqualmie Wildlife Corridor, Hood Canal, salmon refuge basins, and restoring riparian areas and floodplains. These are not, certainly many of these places are on officially forest lands. A lot of the biggest challenges are not on what are designated forest lands, but what we need to do is try to restore forested conditions. So thanks very much.